Okay, good morning, everyone. I put together a really nice slideshow, but it's not working, so we'll have to do this kind of old school. So this may take a minute, and I don't know how this is going to work. But the stuff that I was going to show you, I will describe it to you. I will read it to you. So you're going to have to use your imagination today, and I apologize for that. First, a question. By a show of hands, how many of you out there have taken a course in African American history? Okay, that's way more than I expected. Okay, well, what I want to do today is to have you to center African Americans in our examination of African American experience today, African American history today. Center African Americans in our view of Black Nashville today. It's changing, but it's not showing up. Okay, okay, let me give him one more shot, and then if it doesn't work, then. All right, bravo. Okay. All right, now for the brilliant slideshow. When I first moved here, I moved here to teach African American history at TSU, and I was just curious about how it was represented in the city. Because you can go to the plantations. As a matter of fact, we're right across the way from one right now. And you can go downtown and in other spaces. But oftentimes you really have to look to find any example that says that Black folks lived here, that they died here, that they worked here. And I always found that to be curious because TSU is celebrating homecoming this week. And my family sometimes comes to town to visit me, right? And they'll come on Friday and leave on Monday. And then as I walk around my house, I could tell that they've been there. Because something's out of place. Refrigerator is probably empty. Cars don't have any gas in it. And then my libation cabinet, all of the good stuff is gone. You start thinking about it, wow, they've been there for 3 days. So if I go to a plantation that was established in the early 19th century, and I know that African Americans have been there from that point to 1865 when slavery probably ends. So we're talking about generations of African Americans that are there, day after day after day. Then it seems to me that if I go out there, I should see some evidence of them being there. And I don't know whether it's how we've been taught or whether or not we don't really know how to look, whether or not we're not even equipped to look for these things. Because you can look up in the sky and you can see some stars, right? But once you get a telescope, you see more stars. So what I humbly suggest to you that is we need to continue to study, to equip ourselves to better see the experience, to better understand it, and to better interpret it. I want to start off with a quote that was written by one of my favorite poets. This is Jasmine Ward. She says, "The farther we marched, the hotter it got. Our skin grew around the rope. Our muscles melted to nothing, our fat to bone. The land rolled to a flat bog. And in the middle of it, a city called New Orleans. because she's talking about New Orleans, but envision us looking at Nashville now. When we shuffled into that town of the dead, they put us in pens. They fattened us, tried to disguise our limbs or the pallor of sickness out of our skins, raped us to assess our soft parts, then told us lies about ourselves to make us into easier cells. Was told to answer yes when they asked of us if we were master seamstresses, blacksmiths, or ladies' maids. Was told to disavow the wives we thought we heard calling our names when we first woke in the morning, the husbands we imagined lying with us, chest to back, while the night torches burned, the children whose eyelashes we thought we could still feel on our cheeks when the rain turned to a fine mist while we stood in lines outside the pens, waiting for our next hell to take legs and seek us out. Trade our past lives for new deaths. This is a piece she wrote for the 1619 feature that ran in the New York Times. But I want to start our journey today by looking at the public square. The public square is one of my favorite spots in the city. It's a space that I love and a space that I find very troubling. If you look on the screen here, and y'all can't see this, but most of these folks are TSU alumni with the exception of Mayor Barry. And they're also heroes. They are members of the student group at TSU that participated in the civil rights movement. But when I look at that space, it's a space now where we celebrate the struggle for freedom, but for most of the city's history, this was ground zero for slavery in Nashville. One thing I want you to consider is that the city of Nashville was the second largest slave port in the volunteer state. The only people that brought more slaves through Tennessee than us was Memphis. This was a place whose population grew as a result of slavery. When you start thinking about the year the city was established, and then you start thinking about, y'all remember hearing about the Louisiana Purchase? Y'all remember hearing about that? Okay. Well, our population begins to grow because people are coming here from North Carolina and Virginia. They're coming here to make their way into Alabama and into Mississippi. But the African Americans that came here, they are getting ready to experience a new type of slavery, because we're mindful that, Virginia, the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. You're talking about the 1790s when Nashville gets set up. So now you have a situation where African Americans are coming from very mature slave societies into something brand new. And I'll confess to y'all that I was a country boy a long time before I became a professor, right? My father builds houses, so he would have my brother and I, we'd go out and we'd knock down trees and pull up stumps and clear land, making it ready for him to do whatever, whether it was going to plant a few collards or something like that, or whether he was going to build a house on it. So I knew how difficult the labor was when it came to transforming land from a wilderness into something else. Well, this is what these Africans are witnessing when they come here. And oftentimes try to imagine what it would have been like to march from Virginia to this bluff that overlooks the Cumberland, what I would have saw. And at Fort Nashboro, to their credit, and I don't know how many of you have been down there, but they've tried to recreate it, but it's going to be tough to get an accurate image with all that going on down Broadway, right? But what they would have seen, and it's kind of cool because I actually walked in the woods with a guy from the U.S. Forest Service this weekend. And I said, well, what would have been like if I would have been one of these enslaved persons to arrive in Nashville at the turn of the 19th century? Well, he said, you probably would have seen a lot of hickories. And I did not know there were multiple varieties of hickories, but he enlightened me on that. You would have seen a lot of cedars, hawthorns. He started naming out all kind of trees that, as a Floridian, I had never really seen. And then he talked about this, and you can't really see that, but that's a river cane. But they would have to transform this, and we started thinking about what their lives would have been like. It would have been difficult. But having said that, wow, we know that they were here, but their names have largely been lost to our public memory, which is a shame because these were some amazing, amazing people. For example, there's a guy named Anthony Bledsoe who arrives here. He was a pioneer and a surveyor, early settler of Davidson County. From the record, we also learn of a guy named Abraham. Abraham was a slave who received some acclaim for shooting and killing a Cherokee known as Mad Dog. And then you have one of the most interesting characters, I think, in the city's history. And you know how when we think of Tennessee, we think of, you know, there's some figures that are larger than life, like Davy Crockett and others. But I'd like to add this gentleman's name to the list, Jack Civil. Jack Civil, we're not really sure, but he came here either as a free man or enslaved with the Donaldson Party. And he comes in and he blends into the society. But he demonstrates this sort of precarious existence that African Americans had, in that he worked, he did things like he was supposed to do, but when it came time for James Robertson to issue land warrants, his name wasn't on the list. So I can imagine him being upset about that, to be sure, but he can't really act out. And there's an event that occurs near the Stones River near Donaldson. And I love this space in the city. They have a beautiful walkway down in Donaldson. So if y'all are ever looking for me and I'm not in my office, chances are I'm walking along this space. But the Donaldson Party, they go down here to harvest corn. They've planted corn in this area. And they are attacked by a band of Cherokee who are hiding in the woods. And this group decimates this party. Many people die. But Jack Civil isn't one of them. And I don't know whether he fought and gave up or whether he just surrendered. But anyway, he was taken prisoner. And the Cherokee take him down near Chattanooga. Then a curious thing happens. Seems as though Jack Civil joins the Cherokee, right? And he begins to attack white settlers as they travel into Middle Tennessee. And he gains a somewhat notorious reputation, so much so that they named the settlement. They say that he establishes a settlement along the river, and they call this place Nickajack's Place. And you know, when I moved up here from Savannah, I'm riding, and I see that sign, and I was like, hey, that doesn't look quite. And it turns out I read it correctly, because that's what they call it, Nickajack's Place. He gained a reputation for being a ruthless, I mean, if we're talking in terms of early villains in the volunteer state, he would probably qualify as one. But the site was ultimately taken over, and lo and behold, Jack Civil returns to Nashville. But he says this. He informs the city leaders that he never drew his gun or shot at a white person. And they welcome him back into society. And according to the story, he marries a Cherokee woman and lives happily ever after. Okay. That is an amazing story. And I think we should add it to our canon of stories when we deal with legendary Tennesseans. Okay, this is a shot from my most recent trip at Nickajack Lake. I'm a historian, but if I can ever figure out a way to get paid fishing, I give all this TSU money up. Okay. A couple of points I want to make. Most Southerners did not own a single slave. According to the numbers, only about a quarter of the population, 25% of the population. And of that 25%, only about 25% own more than 20. And that's important because once you cross that 20 threshold, you're considered a planter. Nashville, or Davidson County rather, because these are the numbers I have, pretty much follow suit. And this is a chart. It looked good last night, but I don't know how it's going to play out today. On this side, you have the percentage of the population that African Americans made during these years. So 1790, I don't have that year, but 1800, they represent about 30% of the population. 1810, 40%, and so on up until the Civil War. So we can see that they made up a significant part of the population. And I humbly submit to you that you can't make up that much of a population without having an impact on that population, on the laws that are passed, how people move in this society. Similarly, when we look at slave owners, or the people that actually own slaves, and I don't know if I have a chart for this one, no I don't. The vast majority of people who are slave owners in this area own one slave. Then it drops off to 2. Then it continues to plummet until you get to people that own 14 slaves. And that's one of the mysteries I'm trying to figure out. How did we get to that spike? And then it drops again. Now, when we envision slavery, you start thinking about Gone with the Wind and people working from can't see to can't see. When we envision slavery like that, that was an anomaly here. There were only 3 families actually that could even qualify as big-time slave owners. And you guys can probably guess a couple of them. Okay, the Hardings out here in Belmead, the Overton family at Travelers Rest, and then Andrew Jackson. These are the only families in town that crossed that threshold of where they were owning hundreds of slaves. But the city of Nashville also owned slaves. And we know this because we have a record of these folks. This particular chart, and y'all can't make out the names, but it's really instructive because these are African Americans that are purchased by the county, right? And you can kind of imagine what type of work they would be doing. So they'd be out in the streets, cleaning the streets, during the sort of maintenance, during the sort of labor that we see city workers doing today. But these are instructive because they give you some insight into just the slave experience. I'll read a couple of these to you. Okay, this is Jim. Jim is the third one down. Jim, physical description, 5 feet 2 inches tall, dark brown complexion, a scar on the inside right knee. Also 2 scars on the right arm, one above, one below, and one above the elbow. And then you have Frank. Frank stands 5 feet 7 inches tall, black complexion, 2 of his upper and all of his under front teeth out. And when we hear that, you start thinking, well, wow, what causes people to lose their teeth? I mean, you can get severe trauma to the mouth, and that might knock out a couple, but for all of them to fall out, you had to start thinking about malnutrition or what exactly this guy was eating. Okay. And lastly, we'll look at Alan at the bottom. 5 feet 11 and a half inches tall, complexion black, small scar on the back of his right hand, small scar in the left eyebrow. And you notice all of these folks that I've read to you, they bear the marks of a very brutal existence. Scars on the inside of the leg, outside of the leg, scars over the eye. Okay. But when we look at this period, we try to, when I teach this period, I try to put a personal face on the experience of the enslaved. And I train all of my students to do this. And one of my former students is actually out here at Belle Meade doing it now. And I hope you all get an opportunity to take her Road to Jubilee tour. It is outstanding. But we try to look at this through the eyes of the enslaved. And you know, Belle Meade is known for its horses, and they have some pretty tasty wine out there as well. Done a lot of research on that. But the thing is, this was curious because I remember going out there and thinking, we know all of the names of every single horse out there. You can point at a picture and say, what's the name of that horse? And they can tell you. And you say, who is this guy standing next to them? And nobody knows. So we try to experience these spaces through this, and primarily through the eyes of women. And I don't want y'all to feel like I'm really enlightened because it took me a long time to get to the space, right? But here's why. The status of a child during this period always followed that of its mother. Okay, so if mama's a slave, then all of the children are going to be slaves. And as long as women are having baby girls, you're going to have a slave population. But I know this and also understand that oftentimes our mothers are our first teachers. And in my class, I oftentimes ask my students out there, I'll say, okay, who can bake me a cake from scratch? And if it's good, I'll give everybody an A. And some girl, usually some young woman, she'll throw her hand up. And I said, who gave you that recipe? And she'll say, Mama, or maybe Grandma. And say, who gave it to her? And then maybe Grandma or great-grandma. Then I tell her that slavery for them is about 4 grandmas away. Does that make sense? 4 grandmas away. So the survival strategies that was very much needed to get through this experience was primarily given through the women. So when I look at these places, whether it's the Hermitage, whether it's Travelers Rest, whether it's right over here at Belle Meade, or even at the zoo, we always try to figure out what were the women feeling, what were they doing. Okay. Now I want to talk about public memory. How do we commemorate these spaces? And the city has done some with their monuments at the public square. They've done a good job, and I'm friends with the people that have worked on it, so I'm not critiquing them. I'm saying what they did was a good start, but there's still much, much more to do, and you'll understand why in a moment. But there's a marker for a gentleman named Jeffrey Locklear. Jeffrey Locklear was a free man of color who worked at the courthouse following a military career in Jackson's army. Major Jeffrey, as he was called Nashville home for 20 years. His 1830 obituary eulogized him as one who bestowed his best days to the service of his country, lived a life of benevolence, and died praising God. And that, for me, is interesting because it reveals at least an internal struggle among blacks to define just what it means to be free. And think about this. Think about your notions of freedom. What does it mean to be free today? And then compare that with what you would think their notions of freedom would have been around the turn of the century. Are they the same or are they different? If so, how are they different? But it says that Locklear was a free man of color and he's working at the courthouse, which is really interesting because in my mind, the courthouse is one of the places in town that best represents the psychological trauma of slavery. And here's the reason why. Typically, on Saturday afternoons from roughly around 2 p.m. to late in the afternoon, they sold African Americans on the steps of the courthouse. That's every single Saturday. And when I tried to wrap my mind around, just what that meant and the impact that it might have had on these people, I really struggled with it. So I'm fortunate in that I surround myself with some pretty smart people, right? You don't have to know everything, just know people that know stuff that you don't know. I spoke to some social workers. Okay, and these were two TSU students that were majoring. Well, the young lady on the right was majoring in psychology at the time. But I asked them, I said, okay, what sort of emotions do you think the people on the steps of the courthouse would feel upon being sold or at the prospects of being sold? What do you, as women, what would y'all think they would experience? And he told me some really good stuff. Said they would have, expected for the folks to have separation anxiety, inability to trust anyone. For children, and this is kind of difficult because you start thinking about the conversations we have with our children. How do you prepare them for something like that? And the girl in the blue jacket said that anger would probably be a response. And then I asked one of the professor friends at TSU, and I said, this is what they told me. And then she said, yeah, all of that is true, Lee, but the thing is, that would become normalized for them. This is how they would always feel. So now I'm saying all of that to say this. So now when we go to these plantations and you are given these sort of images of these happy-go-lucky enslaved people, this is not, I can't reconcile that with what I know happened there. This is the church that sits on Andrew Jackson's plantation. If you go to the Hermitage and you keep driving straight on through, the church is back there. This church was constructed in 1823. And it's a big monument to Christianity, initially Rachel's desire that Jackson become a Christian, right? And it's still there. Enslaved African Americans worshiped in this church. So when we see this and we start thinking about Christianity and the role that it played in enslavement, for many slave masters, it was used as a tool to control or to pacify the enslaved that lived here in Nashville. But by that same token, African Americans utilized Christianity to fit their needs. And let me explain. While some may have worshiped in this church, in order to worship God as they saw fit, they would have had to escape to the woods or escape to the swamps. And oftentimes, I told you how I like to walk along the Stones River Greenway. I like to imagine them coming out in that space and making that space a space of catharsis, if you will, where you can catch all kind of trouble all week, but at the end of the week you could go there and praise God as you saw fit. We don't have a whole lot of monuments to slavery in this city, but anytime you go past an African American church in the city that has roots that go beyond 1865, that's your monument there. So my church, I attend First Baptist Capitol Hill. Nelson Mary was a pastor that came up out of slavery to create that church, and start thinking about all those other churches that branch out beyond that. So Spruce Street and Mount Olive, those are oftentimes the monuments we have. And this is Jackson's, this is supposed to be Alfred's cabin out at the Hermitage. And and for those of y'all that have visited the Hermitage and the story they tell about Alfred was beloved. He's actually buried on site. And you get the idea that, for all of the behaviors that we associate with Jackson with the Native American population, you kind of get the feeling from going out there that he treated the slaves okay. But when we look at the record, we have to push back against that. This is terrible, but I'm gonna read it to you anyway. Okay. It says, "Stop the runaway. $50 reward. Eloped from the subscriber living near Nashville on the 25th of June last. A mulatto slave, about 30 years old, 6 feet and an inch high, stout, made and active, Talks sensible, stoops in his walk, and has a remarkable large foot. Brought across, let me get up here on the computer so I can actually read it. Okay. Brought across the root of his toes, will pass for a free man. As I am informed, he has obtained by some means certificates as such. Took with him a drab great coat, dark mixed body coat, and a ruffled shirt, cotton homespun shirts and overalls. He will make for Detroit, though through the states of Kentucky and Ohio, or the upper part of Louisiana. The above award will be given to any person that will take him and deliver him to me, or secure him in jail so that I can get him. If taken out of the state, the above reward and all reasonable expenses paid, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300. Andrew Jackson, near Nashville, state of Tennessee. So despite all of the stories that we hear, one thing, if you don't take anything from this talk today, realize that slavery existed as a result of violence in the South, particularly if you're looking at Nashville, same thing comes into play. So it exists as a result of the club, the whip, the gun, this is what was used to control this population. So we've established Nashville as being an important site in the trade of slaves in the volunteer state. And slavery, I humbly submit to you, was the city's biggest business. Matter of fact, some historians have argued that in terms of capital, you had no greater capital in the South than the enslaved population. So you could take the value of the slaves and compare that to the value of everything else in the South that has value. So the land, which is important, the private property, most of the value would still rest in the enslaved population. So it's an important space. It's the city's biggest business. So where are the representations of this? We don't see anything about slave brokers anywhere on Charlotte Avenue, or the public square, a space where you could go and you could buy clothes for the enslaved population. You could buy tools. You could, if you wanted to buy land and buy slaves and you didn't have the money, you could go to the Planters Bank and get a loan on them on some very generous terms. So most of these spaces aren't here anymore. But if you're interested in traveling down this route, you guys know where the public square is. Travel down Cedar. Well, it's not Cedar. It ain't even Charlotte anymore. It's Martin Luther King now. What used to be Charlotte Avenue. Drive from the public square to Charlotte Avenue up until about 4th Avenue North. On both sides of the streets, you would have had slave brokers. Some of the more well-known, more profitable brokers include, and some of these names still resonate today in Nashville. So William L. Boyd, Henry H. Hayne, George W. Hitchens, Riley Phillips, Thomas Sanders, and T.R. Smith. Okay. These were the brokers, and we're mindful that they're making tremendous profit, and they don't even own the slaves. They are the men that the enslaved are brought to, and they sell them. Okay. And many of them oftentimes would argue that they didn't break up families. And that's interesting because, you sold enslaved people one at a time, which meant when they hit that auction block, they had some family somewhere that was not there with them. They had friends, they had somebody somewhere that cared for them. And these advertisements, which appear in the newspapers, are very instructive, and they cause you to think as well about the true nature of the institution here in the city. For example, this one says, notice, I will offer for sale on Saturday, the 7th of March next, at the Market House in Nashville on a credit of 10 months. A likely boy about 7 years of age. A note payable to the Union Bank with good security will be required. Sale at 11 o'clock. And when you start thinking about this, it's like, wow, he's mentioning that it's a 7-year-old boy. And you start thinking, what grade are you in when you're 7? Like 2nd grade? Okay. And start thinking about the conversation that whoever was raising this boy had with them on the morning that he departed. Okay. So in all of this, I just want to make sure we emphasize or affirm the humanity of these people. Yeah. Still, but I'm looking to see what the experience would have been like for people that were brought here. During the 1930s, the WPA sent out people all across the South to talk with the aging population of slaves. And they, one of the things I do, I'm a coordinator of the North Nashville Heritage Project. I'm really interested in North Nashville. Well, they found somebody on Jefferson Street. And this lady, in discussing the yard, she says, yeah, I remember the yard. And she gave a really interesting description of it. She says, the slave yard was on Cedar Street. That would have been Charlotte. Mr. Chandler would bid the slaves off, but before they started bidding, you had to take your clothes off and roll down the hill so that they could see that you didn't have any bones broken or sores on you. I wouldn't take mine off. If nobody bid on you, you was took to the slave mart and sold. I was sold there. A bunch of them was sent to Mississippi, and they had their ankles fastened together, and they had to walk while the traders rid. Okay. That space is a space of trauma for the community as a whole, because you start thinking about, well, free blacks that are living in the city, what would have been like for them to walk by and see this on a daily basis? How would this affect them? And we're mindful that even though you're free and black in Nashville during this period, your life was very much restricted. In many instances, for example, you couldn't be out after sundown. For many free blacks, Nashville becomes a sundown town. You had a slave patrol in this city, in which the members of the patrol, which typically they worked from October to April and April to October. This was a group that would go around the city and look for runaways. And they had tremendous authority for ordinary citizens. They could accost any black person on the street that they saw that was out of place. They could enter into any dwelling that was either lived in by a free person or an enslaved person. And they had the right to punish folks as they saw fit. And in looking at dwellings, let me mention this. You had an enslaved population that lived in the city. Okay, oftentimes when we think of slavery, you have folks that work on the gang system, right, that work from can't see to can't see out in the fields. You have folks that work under a task system where they're given a job, and once they complete the job, the rest of the day is their own. And then you have some that are hired out, and those are the ones that are really interesting when we look at slavery in this city. A hired out slave was a slave with a skill, and what usually occurred is their master would send them out to do work, and once they earned wages, they would bring the money back to their master. And sometimes, right, the master might allow them to keep some money. And for a frugal enslaved person, I save up enough money, I might be able to buy my freedom. So the enslaved population that you have living in the city, many of them were hired out. John Overton had a mule skinner that he would send to town from time to time. And some fathers, oftentimes when their daughters would get married, you know, as a father, you might not trust the guy that your baby girl's about to marry. So to make sure that she's secure, you would give her a slave as a gift that she could send out and work for her so that she'd have a source of income. Okay. I said that we don't have any monuments for the slave markets here in Nashville, but I wouldn't be entirely true. We do have one, because I and my students pushed to have one placed at the corner of 4th and Charlotte. And wow, this is the photograph I really wanted y'all to see, and y'all can't see it. Okay. If you go to the corner of 4th and Charlotte, you know, right where the bus transfer point is, if you go there, there's a marker for the slave market at that corner. And its placement is, although I got a lot of credit for it, My students, actually, I'll give them some credit because they said, well, Dr. Williams, we ought to put it where, it can be in a place where a lot of people can see it. So we put it at that corner where the bus transfer point is. You think about how many people catch the city bus every day and walk past this point. So it's there, and I've done a lot of things since I've been at TSU, and when I look back at my career, whether it be good or bad, this is one that I would like to hang my hat on. We put that marker there. But as I've said, slavery was big business. If you go to the public square and we look at the businesses that were there, we see that many of the businesses, even though they might not actually have slavery in their descriptions, we see where they are supporting, where they are augmenting the slave experience. So here's Morgan and Company at 49 in the public square. Specialize in Negro clothing, blankets, jeans, linsey, heavy woolen socks. So the clothes that were necessary to tend to your slaves for the year could be found there. And then if you needed, most of the time when we think of enslaved folks being sold, we think of agriculture. But here's another one at the public square where this guy selling a groom, a house servant, and a horse trainer. So the square becomes ground zero. I humbly submit to you that if you start studying slavery in Nashville, you probably need to start at the public square. Okay, and this one. Reese W. Porter was a slave broker that lived in Gallatin. He lived in Gallatin, but he had a shop right at about 4th Avenue North in Charlotte. But in this, he says this. He says, I have a large number of Negroes on hand that must be sold, and amongst them some valuable families. And as I never separate families, I will give good bargains. Also, several fancy girls. And I do expect the best cook in Tennessee. I mean what I say. By show of hands, how many of y'all know what a fancy girl is? Okay. Typically, these were young girls who were of mixed ancestry, either octoroons, which then meant they were 1/8 black, or quadroons, which meant that they were 1/4 black. And they were purchased to be concubines, for lack of a better term. And typically, their masters would purchase them, but they couldn't take them back to the plantation, right? Because you got your wife and so forth living back there. But they put them up in an apartment in town. And these women could live more or less as free persons until their masters came to town. But what is interesting in this is that they were able to, these women had some agency in that they could make demands upon their masters, and the masters oftentimes would comply. So when you look at them, you oftentimes could see them, they walk around town and they're looking a little bit better than many of the freed people, and in some cases, better than some of the poor whites that they encounter. The kids are dressed a little bit better. They might live in a better apartment, if you will. And as quiet as it's kept, these women were, when we start thinking about how much a person would pay for an enslaved person, these women were the most expensive. So you're paying all that money, there's no way they're going to be in anybody's kitchen or out in the field picking cotton. So they have some agency, but it came at a very, very high cost because they don't have control over their bodies. and insurance on Negroes. This is something that always strikes my students, and it speaks to how enslaved people were commodified. So insurance on Negroes, house servants, farm hands, steamboat firemen, cabin boys, at customary rates of premium. Policies issued and losses promptly adjusted at the Nashville agency, Joseph Nash Agent. And the insurance company, and this insurance company is still around today, Aetna Insurance Company of Hartford, office northwest corner of the public square opposite the Planters Bank. Now, the last part of my lecture will deal with resistance. We hear the narrative of happy-go-lucky slaves, but when we look at the newspaper, we see example after example after example of enslaved people running away. And their masters are trying to lay hands on them, right? Resistance could take many forms. It could be something as simple as burning the master's farm down, burning the master's barn down, because we recognize that all of them had access to fire. It could be something as simple as poisoning their masters. If I'm a cook and there's probably going to be some rat poison around somewhere, so I can put that in the food, and that'll be a slow death, right? They could pretend to be sick. They could break the master's tools. Sometimes they could engage in self-mutilation. Or some oftentimes could run away. And these runaway ads are most instructive for me about the experience, because it gives you a description of them. So you get a physical description of what they look like, and then their condition when they ran away. Y'all take a moment to look at that while I catch my breath for a second and tell me what jumps out at you after reading. Can y'all see that ad? Okay. Sara is about 15. And it says she's common size, but she says she's also pregnant with child. We started looking at this, started thinking about the motives for her running away. And it could be many, but I oftentimes, when I'm feeling a little bit creative, I'll have my students write, put themselves in the place of a person like Sara and write about why she might be running away. What does it say? Runaway or stolen. You don't know for sure. But one point I want to make too, and this is important. I'll make sure that y'all get this book when next time we talk. Sara would have been very valuable for her master. Not only for what she could do, right? But she's pregnant. So every single baby that she gave birth to, whether it was 1 or 5 or 10 or whatever, would increase the master's wealth. So we can see, and I got this ad, it's from an 1840 newspaper. $25 was a lot of money back then, particularly when you think about our Union soldiers being paid about $13 a month. So $25, and for the thief, $50. And then there are other forms of resistance that, and I'm reticent to even describe this picture to it because it might mess up the sight for you. This is a photograph of the Woodland Street Well, I'm standing, and I'm facing I want to say the Woodland Street Bridge. And for this photograph, I took a quote from Toni Morrison's Beloved. And some of y'all may have read that, and I try to read it once a year because it touches on just about everything I've talked to you about today. But this quote says, "She stopped him," she said, staring at the place where the fence used to be. "I took and I put my babies where they'd be safe." And it's Toni Morrison, Beloved. And if you don't know the story, Toni Morrison, what she did was she took the story of a formerly enslaved woman who ran away with her children. And she was caught by slave catchers, but before the slave catchers could actually lay hands on her, she pulled out a knife and slit one of her baby's throats. And what Toni Morrison did was she brought the child back from the dead, and then she plays with just about every theme in African American history. And what does that got to do with me looking at the Cumberland here? Amiri Baraka, prominent black poet, once wrote, he says, "There's a railroad at the bottom of the Atlantic, and it's made of human bones." And I thought about that, and it's like, wow, we can say the same thing for the Cumberland. There was a woman who was enslaved. She had 2 babies, and her husband lived on another plantation. And we're not really sure what their plan was and how they were going to escape. But she was supposed to meet them at the Woodland Street Bridge after dark. So she gets there with her babies, and she's waiting and waiting and waiting. Her husband doesn't show. So finally, when she realizes that she's not going to show, she takes a child in each arm and jumps off the bridge into the water. And all 3 of them end up drowning. And for me, when I hear this story, I think about love, right? What's one of the most powerful or visual expressions of love you can imagine? It's that when you see a mother look at her child, that is love. Mothers will oftentimes do anything for their kids. So start thinking about what she was experiencing here in Nashville that would cause her to get to the point where jumping into the icy waters of the Cumberland was preferable to remaining enslaved. And these stories are all over the place when we start looking. These names don't mean anything to me, but it may resonate to some of y'all. In this one, this is a girl who was owned by a guy named L.C. Lisby here in town who committed suicide. Her mother had run off, and the girl being threatened with punishment if she did not give information about where her mother had went, she takes her life. So these are some of the more drastic forms of resistance, I think. But there's something that I want you guys to consider before you leave today. I talked about Nashville being a place where the enslaved were ushered to the Deep South, but also view it as a space where many fugitives came seeking liberty. And let me explain. You got ships constantly coming in up and down the Cumberland, and they are unloading and loading stuff up in Nashville. So for a slave who's trying to get to Ohio, if he reasons that I might not be in condition to make it through Kentucky to get to Ohio, an easy way to, I shouldn't say easy, but a good way to get to the North would be to stow away on one of these steamers right outside the public square. And you could travel maybe in I spoke with Dr. Busey about this, about how long would it take to get from here to the Ohio River. I think she told me about 4 days. So if I could stow away on a ship, and if I'm lucky, then 4 days from here, I would be a free person. Okay. So it becomes both a gateway to slavery and a gateway to freedom for some. And then finally, all of this stuff that we are talking about, be mindful of this, that when the Civil War breaks out, there are a little over 14,000 African Americans that are living here in Nashville. And their slave experience vary from place to place. You have some slaves who have a difficult life here, some who come here and make the best of it, but they're largely removed from our collective memories. For example, this gentleman on the screen, his mother's name was Sara Thomas. Okay, this spot, I think that's the corner of DeMondre that's Dieterich and 4th Avenue North. His mom came here from Virginia, and she brought 2 boys in tow. She brought 2 boys in tow. And she gets here and she convinces her master to allow her to hire herself out. And he does, so she washes clothes. And we believe that her shop is located right where the DoubleTree is downtown. So she gets work as a washerwoman. She washes clothes. And here's the thing, she's washing clothes, but she's not spending any money because her ultimate goal is to buy her baby's freedom, right? So I can imagine her taking these loads of clothes down to the Cumberland and washing, but when she looks at these shirts, she doesn't see a shirt, right? When she's looking at this and she's seeing chains, okay? So I'm gonna break this chain and break this chain and break this chain, then ultimately my babies will be free. So she hires one of her sons out. One of her sons finds employment with an attorney in the city, and he becomes beloved by this gentleman. So much so when this gentleman dies, he leaves money for this young man to purchase his freedom. Then her second son manages to run away. He escapes to his freedom. But then, you remember I said she had 2 boys in tow, right? So she has another son, and this is what is curious. We know that she was washing clothes to free her 2 sons. So what in the world is she doing having another son? And the son was by a gentleman whose name escaped me right now, who would ultimately become a judge in this city. I don't know, we started having to think about relationships between enslaved women and white men or their masters, and whether or not these relationships could ever be defined as being consensual. But she earns money and she's about $50 short, so she reaches out to another attorney who spots her the $50, but then before her son can purchase his freedom, she dies. But nevertheless, that story, in terms of all of the stories that we have here in the Music City, I think it's one that we should celebrate because it's one that's very much steeped in love, steeped in hope, a lot of things that we like to embrace. And that's my last slide, so I think it's time for questions. Yes.
Did any of the African Americans own slaves themselves?
Yes, and that's a really good question. It increasingly, oh, I'm sorry. It became, she asked, did any African Americans own slaves in the city? And the answer is yes. After 1831, it became increasingly difficult to be free in Nashville and in the volunteer state. In that if your master freed you, then you'd have to leave the state. And what that means, if you freed one person and he got some loved ones here, then he has to leave and it breaks up their family. But if I'm a free African American and I know that it'd be almost impossible for me to be with a woman that's enslaved in the state, so if she got to be owned by somebody, then it might be good if I'm her owner. Does that make sense? If I'm a mother and I know that a guy owns my children and he might be struggling, and I know that if they're sold or whatever, they might be separated from me, then I might want to be their owner. But after a while, and I know I'm beating this question to death, and I'm sorry. By the 1850s, it was almost, well, not almost, it was a requirement that if you were going to free your slaves, you had to send them to Africa. And you find two examples of this. It was a judge down in Franklin, I can't remember his name, but Montgomery Bell also sent 150 people to Africa. Okay, very good question, thank you. Okay.
In mentioning the wealthy slave owners,
Mm-hmm.
you did in the different plantations, you didn't mention Andalusia Ackland and Selma, and yet we know that she made lots of money by being able to sell her cotton during the Civil War.
Yeah, and it was not a slight to her, but I know that a lot of her wealth was based down in Louisiana, and I tried to, and even that even isn't a fair answer because Jackson had property in Mississippi as well. Okay.
Question, how many slaves? I mean, earlier you said something about they had to have 30 slaves?
20.
Or more, 20 slaves or more to qualify as being a plantation.
Mm-hmm. To be in a planter, and even when we get, and I see you don't go nowhere. Even during the Civil War, when the Civil War breaks out, there's a what's called a 20 Negro clause that said that if you own 20 African Americans, then you didn't have to go and fight. Okay, and we're mindful that to own a human being at this time, it was really only really wealthy folks could afford it. And you start thinking about, and I'm not good in math, and these figures may be kind of dated, but I'll give them to you anyway. 1840s, if you bought somebody that cost about $800, in today's dollars, that would be like $26,000, $27,000. So it's like buying not to be flippant or anything, but like buying a Honda Accord or something like that. And you think about buying 20 of those, how many of us could afford to do that today, or 50 or 100? Okay. Question in the back. And it's kind of a difficult question because we're mindful that they're coming from different places. So I don't know if I can say, okay, this is what they look like. But I could tell you about most of their lives. I know that every aspect of her life was governed by their owner. For a guy, when we start thinking about these sort of gender roles that we have today, fella's supposed to be like the breadwinner and all of that breaks down. chances are you were going to be sold at least once in your life. But for women, women were carriers of a generational curse. You understand what I mean by that? Because whatever their status is, they're passing that along to the children. So giving birth for them, which in most instances is a period of great joy. It's like, look what I have created. But by that same token, you're bringing a child into a world that is not going to show them the love that you would ordinarily have them to give, you have them experience. Okay? So it's, I don't know if I could just say this is what it would look like for a guy and this is what it would look like for a woman, but the experience would be different though, because with women, you know, they would have to deal with all of the sexual assault and all the other stuff that we deal with.
I'm sorry, I think the word enslavers or slave owners is what the folks out who own slaves.
Who are owning them? Oh, okay. They are the upper crust of society. It's plain and simple because of the wealth that was needed to purchase somebody. And I mean, like, you know, these would be the kind of folks that, you know, today we have certain folks that we look up to, like, okay, one day I want to, if I'm a hip hop artist, right, it's like one day I want to be like Jay-Z or somebody. These are the folks that were looked up to. And even if you weren't a slave owner, you could be part of the system, an important part of the system, because, hey, most of the folks that worked as overseers were not slave owners. Most of the people that participated in the slave patrols weren't slave owners. And the slave catchers, more often than not, weren't slave owners. Okay, let me get somebody over here, and I think y'all probably throw me out. Okay, let me get you and then get you. Yes?
You said that the city or the county owned slaves. How were they managed or provided for or whatever?
More often than not in the workhouse. Workhouse was like a prison, but not a prison. But they'd be fed and clothed and then sent out to do various tasks over the day. Okay, and this is the last one because I think I've gone way over. Okay, yes.
The woman who took in laundry to save money for her sons, I'd like to know her name.
Sara Thomas. Mm-hmm.
Can you put the slides on the website so we can look at them?
I'll save it as a PDF and give it to somebody here. Okay. All right, thank y'all. I'm sorry for holding you late.